I don't know if anyone will ever hear what I'm saying, but if I leave no trace of everything that happened to me, I'm sure it will happen again. I'm terrified at the thought that such a platform could exist, and yet it's a reality, a horrible, heartbreaking reality, one that seems impossible to have any control over. I'm going to tell you about an app that, for now, is hard to find. Sadly, I paid the price. It's often them who end up finding you anyway. This app is called Spoticry. Once again, I was too curious. I really like going on the darknet for the sole purpose of reading controversial articles and forum discussions about sensitive topics. Or just let myself get curious and look for odd, unhealthy websites without going to extremes. I'm referring to sites that hide code linking to other, equally strange web pages. That kind of site grabs all my attention, and they're more often ARGs than real sites with actual scary content. For example, I've already visited a site that had a black background. I opened the page's source code and noticed a uniform resource locator. I entered it and then ended up on a completely white page this time. In the center there was a place to type text. I never found the site's password, but I imagine it must have been somewhere, in a place I hadn't searched yet. So I continued my adventure and went to the famous site, which lists a fairly large number of the most popular dark web pages. When I clicked on a forum about declassified FBI files, a pop-up appeared. I think that throughout my whole adventure on the other side of the iceberg, I had never had that happen to me even once. The page that had opened had a blood-red background, and right in the center, it was written in capital letters. Spoticry Authentic Podcast. Just to its left was the original Spotify logo, but completely flipped. When I hovered my mouse over it, I realized it was interactive. My curiosity was too strong for me to resist. After interacting with it, I immediately found myself on the homepage of Spoticry. This site looked exactly like Spotify. The only difference was that there weren't all the usual categories, artists, albums, or popular radio's charts, trending playlists, or episodes. None of that was there. Instead, there was only one single category. This one shared the same name as the one on the site's first page. Authentic Podcast. The displayed avatars were all black with no images. The only thing that could differentiate all these channels was their username. There was one called Bella Dishes, Crying Jason, or even Turnface Harry. I couldn't figure out what connection all these usernames had, but I had a strong feeling it wasn't a coincidence. Usually, Spotify had several podcasts of different styles, or music, and many others as well, with no connection between them. Here it was different. Without being able to explain why, I felt that they were all somehow connected to each other. When I saw the username Trash Lady French, I knew then that I was dealing with a French podcast. My curiosity was still very much present in my mind. So I made the mistake of clicking. There were only 5 different sounds on her channel, and each of them was less than 2 minutes long. I clicked the last sound to hear its content in order. After a short silence, I finally heard the voice of the famous Trash Lady.
My name is Lana. I'm 22 years old and...
She began to cry, as if a panic attack was overwhelming her.
I'm going to cut myself. I'm going to cut my leg. And I'll use a saw with rusty teeth. It will be my left leg. I wish you a good listening experience.
And then, right after hearing some metallic noises mixed with Lana's cries, I heard a sharp wet sound. She screamed so loudly that I threw my headphones at my computer screen. The latter, which was now on my keyboard, kept making terrible noises. I heard the woman scream so loudly it distorted, matching the rhythm of metal cutting her flesh. I couldn't take it anymore. With trembling hands, I immediately turned off my PC and ran to the bathroom to throw up. You know, there are a lot of fakes on the darknet. Like I said earlier, ARGs are more like big scavenger hunts that people on the internet have fun with. They also use real elements to enhance immersion, but here it was completely different. I can swear to you that those screams were nothing like a simulation. They would be impossible to imitate. They were so realistic. That's actually what made those screams unbearable to hear. Even if I couldn't say for sure that what I had just heard was real, I was deeply convinced of it. That poor woman, Lana, had just had her leg cut off. As I mentioned to you earlier, I wasn't going on the dark web to see this kind of horror. Contrary to what people believe, it's actually quite difficult to end up on that kind of site by accident without looking for them yourself. I even thought that this kind of content was just an urban legend, that nothing like that could exist, that it was mostly well-made fakes just meant to scare us. But this time, it was so authentic that all my beliefs were shaken. My eyes were still watery when I found myself in front of the PC. When I turned it back on, I saw that I was still on the website. It wasn't curiosity that took over anymore. I just wanted to be able to sleep without having to think about it all night long. Or even the nights after that. I wanted to check if the content I had just heard could possibly be fake, for the sole purpose of calming my mind. So, with hesitation, I clicked on the 5th audio. I wanted to find a single clue that would allow me to say that all of this was just a well-orchestrated setup. The audio crackled briefly. Then, Lana's voice echoed in my headset again.
I am Lana. In this new podcast, you will hear me scream. No.
After that, I heard a noise. I can almost certainly tell you that this sound was the noise of a violent punch. Lana seemed to be trying to catch her breath. Then, after a few seconds, she continued her sentence.
You're going to hear me scream. No, I'm going to get my eyes gouged out.
Before I could process what I'd heard, her piercing scream echoed in my ears. I closed the lid of my laptop. I got up with the intention of going to the bathroom again. With my stomach totally empty, it probably wouldn't have helped. I felt faint, as if my body was incredibly heavy and my legs carried twice my weight. I was trembling all over. Struggling to stand, I leaned on my desk to avoid falling. I reopened the laptop lid, closed the website, then turned off the computer. It was late and I had to get up early the next day to go to work. So I went to bed, somehow managing, leaving the light in my room on. Only, after the horror I had just heard, it was impossible for me to get a wink of sleep all night. I hadn't gotten the proof I came looking for, and my doubts had been swept away with a single stroke. The audio recordings seemed too realistic for them to be just a setup. I felt a lot of sorrow for Lana. I wanted to help her, but I knew it was impossible. I knew she was doomed. I don't know enough to be able to trace where the sound comes from, the site, and even less when it comes from the dark web. I was completely powerless in the face of the situation. The hours went by as I kept staring at the ceiling of my room, wondering if I should consider therapy to recover from this traumatic moment. It was just past 4 a.m. when my phone started beeping. With trembling hands I grabbed it, and I saw that there was a new notification. I received an email from an address I didn't recognize, made up of random numbers and letters that meant nothing to me. So I opened the email and realized that my nightmare was actually just beginning. That's the exact reason why I recorded this message about 2 hours after receiving it. The content of the email was very clear and precise, and it left me with no possibility to act. In this one, there was a message written with an attachment just below it. It said, "Mr. Moraine, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to host our new podcast titled Moraine the Flyhead French. You must go to the address indicated below within 24 hours. Otherwise, we will have to take action quickly. We know she is mute, but we will be happy to include her in our podcast if you refuse our request. If you warn anyone, it goes without saying that your whole life will be drastically affected. Best regards, the Spoticry team." Below the address was the attachment. It was a photo of my little sister Gracie. She's never been able to speak since she was a child. We're still searching for the cause of what's happening to her. As her big brother, I can't imagine anything bad happening to her. I love her more than I could ever love myself. And so, because of that, I'm gonna go to the address they gave. If you ever happen to go on the darknet, now you know what to expect. I suggest you ignore your curiosity and just use regular websites, without drifting off and ending up in the same situation as me. And if you ever decide to go there anyway, and you find the Spoticry website, never try to listen to the audio files. That's probably how they managed to track me, and that's probably why, in the coming days, you might also hear me screaming in one of their podcasts. A friend taught me how to use Google Maps. Of course, everyone knows Google Maps, but I hadn't really paid much attention to it. If you're like me, I have to tell you that this app uses satellite images to show different places around the world. The reason I started using it is that several years ago, I had a car accident. Since then, I don't go out of my house very often. I'm struggling, and seeing a car pass close by gives me palpitations. So I was fascinated by the fact that I could observe the whole world, almost as if I was really there. I could walk through the streets virtually, and all while staying nice and warm at home. I really became addicted, and it allowed me to see the world from a different perspective. I could go from one capital to another in the blink of an eye. I was able to walk the streets of China, Japan, Germany, England, and many more. Visiting the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and Dracula's castle in Romania was amazing. One of my favorite pastimes was going to random places in big cities and counting how many people or animals I could see. Of course, people's faces were always blurred to respect their privacy. I loved watching them enjoy life and walk peacefully through the city. I could do that for hours. At one point, I noticed a young woman on a street in Japan. I zoomed in and noticed the grey bag she was carrying on her shoulder. She seemed to be walking casually, with nice red sneakers, dragging her hand along the wall next to her. I was sure that under her blurred face, there was a smile. I started to feel a little sad. I dropped my hands onto my wheelchair's armrests and looked at him again. I wished I could walk freely with her, but I knew it wasn't possible for me, since I was stuck in this chair. I sighed and left Tokyo. I had seen enough for the evening. I turned off my computer and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to stroll around Paris. Visiting Paris was always fun. I loved the city's beautiful old buildings. Plus, there were many people to watch. I zoomed in randomly, and it brought me to a street lined with old brick buildings. On the street, there were also a few shops and a small church. At the end, there was an intersection and about a dozen people walking there. A bald businessman watched an old lady with a scarf-covered head carrying a large handbag. A voluptuous black woman in nice white pants was looking into the window of one of the shops, and two other women were watching over a small group of young children. I clicked around me a few more times and noticed something unusual. Sitting at a bus stop, there were two people. One of them was a young woman, her legs stretched out casually in front of her. She was wearing a pair of red sneakers. I was surprised to notice her black pants, white t-shirt, and black hooded jacket. Her brown hair was roughly tied back behind her head, and a grey bag was placed on the bench next to her. The strap was still on her shoulder. I couldn't believe it. How could it be the same woman? It was in two different countries, on two opposite continents. How could that be possible? I tried to rationalize. After all, it's not like these were live photos. The photos were taken and then stored on the app's server. Maybe it was just someone who loved to travel. And besides, since their face was blurred, it was impossible to tell if it was really the same person. Brown hair is one of the most common colors in the world, and those red sneakers could definitely be found just about anywhere on the globe. So I decided to take a break and make myself something to eat. When I logged back into the app, I wanted to visit Berlin. As usual, I picked a street at random. It looked pretty empty, and the whole street was surrounded by rough brick buildings that looked more like factories than anything else. There were also empty lots filled with tall grass and gravel. There was little to see besides rows of motorcycles and a car with two German flags on the hood. Looking a bit further, I found a little boy. He was wearing a school uniform, and his jacket was placed on his back. He was staring at his cell phone. I felt a little disappointed, but as I was about to leave the street, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I zoomed in and I couldn't believe my eyes. There they were, those damn red sneakers. The girl stood on the street corner next to a sign. Her hand was resting on it, and she was looking at the road as if she was about to cross. I stared at the screen, shocked. How could she be there too? Even if she was working, there was no way I could find her every time. Finding her in Paris was already a big coincidence. But this was just insane. Was this some kind of joke? Had Google decided to have fun at the expense of its overly curious users? I quickly searched online for answers about this woman who, like Charlie, seemed to be everywhere. But there was nothing. I read several articles about strange things you could find on Google Maps, but none of them mentioned the woman with the red sneakers. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Was my isolation making me crazy, or was loneliness causing hallucinations? Leaving the app open on my screen, I sent a message to my friend asking her to go to the different places and tell me if she saw the same woman as I did. The minutes I spent waiting felt like hours. My hands were sweaty and my heart was pounding like crazy. I jumped when I heard the notification on my phone telling me I had received a text message. Inside it said,
I saw the woman you were talking about in Berlin, but I didn't see her in Paris or in Tokyo. Is this some kind of game or something like that? Are you sure everything is okay?
I didn't answer and I rushed back to the places where I had seen her, in Tokyo and in Paris. And just as I suspected, she was there. She really was there. But this time it was different. In Paris, she was no longer sitting at the bus stop but standing in front of it, searching her bag. In Tokyo, she was several blocks away from where she had been before. She was crouching down and petting a cat. I shivered. Who was she, and what was happening? I decided to take a look around Brussels. I clicked randomly and ended up on a street with lots of old buildings, each with shops on the ground floor. I quickly scanned the nearly empty street. Inside, a woman wore a blue t-shirt. I looked again to be sure, but the girl with the red sneakers wasn't there. I sighed with relief. I couldn't believe I was getting so worked up over this, so quickly I reassured myself by saying it was all just a simple coincidence. But just as I was thinking that, I froze, my eyes glued to the screen. At the very end of the street, there was a building with a series of wrought iron balconies. Since I was looking toward the sidewalk, I hadn't noticed it right away, because it was on one of the second floor balconies. Her head was turned toward the camera, as if she was staring at me. When I saw that, panic overwhelmed me, and I had trouble breathing. I decided to change cities and go to Sydney. And I noticed her right away, leaning against a wall near the doorway of a pharmacy. In London, she was about to get on a double-decker bus, but her head was completely turned. And in my direction, no matter where I went, she was everywhere. She was on a bridge in Venice, on a crosswalk in Zurich, and in Hong Kong, she was standing in front of a McDonald's, adjusting the strap of her bag. In each of the photos, she seemed to be getting closer and closer to the camera. The way her head was turned made me feel like she could see me. My heart was beating so hard it felt like a terrified bird was flapping around inside my chest. I couldn't catch my breath anymore, and I didn't know what to do. I had no real reason to call the police, and would it really help to send screenshots to Google? I clenched my fists, closed my eyes, still unable to figure out who she was. Was she following me, or was I following her? I wish I could have seen her expression. I wanted to know what she felt when she looked at me. I also wanted to get up from this wheelchair and run away. I had finally found something to make me feel free again, and that very thing was about to destroy me. I wanted to know why. So I typed the name of my city and clicked on a random street again. This street, just a few kilometers from my house, led to the city park. The photo had been taken during the day, but at that moment, at my place, it was night. The woman in red sneakers stood beneath a sign displaying the park's name. It felt like the photo was taken even closer than the others. This time there was no doubt. She was looking at me. She could see me. I felt like throwing up. She was very close to my house, and she was looking at me. She was there for me. But what did she want? So I decided to type the name of my residence on the keyboard, and I was able to see the outside of my building. The parking lot in front was full of cars, and there were a few blurred children playing in the playground. I looked for her everywhere. She wasn't in the parking lot or on the sidewalk. She wasn't hiding between the buildings or behind any of the playground equipment either. I even looked behind the windows of every car, behind every bush, but she wasn't there. Relieved, I rested my head on my desk and let out a sigh. Here I was safe. Anyway, I never left my apartment. And then it was decided I was never going to use Google Maps again, so I wasn't at risk of seeing her again. I didn't care if she was in a park not far from me. I was so relieved that I felt a tear roll down my cheek, and I kept telling myself over and over that I was saved. But just as I was calming down, I heard a knock at the door. A shiver ran through my body, since I had a camera built into the doorbell, which was connected to my computer. I slowly clicked on the app to see who was behind the door. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and that's when I realized my mistake. The photos of the outside of my building on Google Maps, which I had taken the time to analyze, would never have shown me the strange woman, because she was already inside my building. On the screen, I could see her white t-shirt, her black pants, her hoodie of the same color, her gray bag, and of course her pair of red sneakers. She was looking at the camera lens, and what scared me the most was that her face was still blurred. It all started when I was 6 years old. I was at school, and I was reading one of my lessons. When I really needed to pee. At that age, it's true that some kids often wet themselves. And I had become paranoid about it, because I didn't want to embarrass myself in public. So I raised my hand, and I asked Mrs. Thompson if I could go to the bathroom. After giving me her speech about, "You should have gone during the break," she finally gave me the keys to the restroom for people with reduced mobility, since those were the ones closest to the classroom. It was the 5th period of the day, and the hallways were empty. I felt like I was going on an adventure into a cave. I was small and very impressionable at that time. I also struggled to open and unlock the doors, causing me to spend several minutes entering the restroom. After I managed to get in, I started doing what I had to do. Then suddenly I heard someone knocking on the restroom door. "Who is there?" I shouted, irritated by the disturbance. Silence followed. Then the knocking resumed, even louder. They were faster, and the person on the other side of the door seemed determined. "Wait, I'm almost done." The knocking slowed down in rhythm, and I heard a voice rise up.
"Let me in. I need to come in."
The person's tone was light, but their voice was dark. It was the voice of an adult I didn't recognize. I was only 6 years old, but I knew something was wrong with him, because there couldn't be more than one person in that bathroom.
"Go away!"
The knocking got louder again, until it sounded like someone beating on a drum. I heard the voice getting louder as well, and the person behind the door became more pleading.
"Let me in. Just open the door."
I was terrified. The banging and shouting were so loud, but even then, no one seemed to want to come help me. And then, finally, my teacher came to get me. She was upset because she had been away from her class for more than 30 minutes. When I refused to open the door for her, she went to get a spare key to open it, before taking me to the principal and calling my parents. Because of that, I was suspended from school for the rest of the week. I never told anyone what happened to me. After that, about a month went by before this happened again. I had just celebrated my 7th birthday, and my family had organized a barbecue in my honor. The sky was especially sunny. But just as we had everything set up behind the house, when it was time to light the barbecue, the charcoal wouldn't catch fire. So my father asked me to go get some fire lighting gel from the old shed in the garden. The shed was pretty messy and full of old junk. So I just opened the door, stood on my tiptoes to grab the gel that was up high, and then I went back out. But just as I closed the door, I heard frantic knocking from the other side, coming from inside the garden shed.
"Open up! I need to get out!"
That voice wasn't the same as the one I had heard the previous month. It was deeper, more aggressive, and above all, angrier. I didn't say anything, and I walked away. I had no idea what was happening, but it scared me. As I walked away from the shelter, I heard one last boom. It sounded like a punch, as if something slammed hard against the door. And the voice was heard again.
"You filthy bastard! I'm going to rip your teeth out! Let me out!"
I ran to my father and spent the rest of the day looking over my shoulder at every sound I heard. You probably guessed it, but it kept happening afterwards. And I heard tons of different voices. I counted about 30 in total. I heard them almost every month. They all wanted the same thing, for me to let them in or out. It happened as soon as I closed the door behind me. It was like these entities were following me. I never talked about it to anyone, but to be honest, after a while, I even got used to it. It always made me jump, and some voices really made me uncomfortable. But I had this feeling that nothing could happen to me if I didn't open the door while it was banging on it. There were some voices that were so familiar to me that I had even given them names. There was one that always appeared, when I closed the front door of the house. On the door, there were slightly frosted glass panes, and I could see the silhouette of a man of average height. He wore a cap. He hardly ever spoke, but sometimes he would pass small brown envelopes through with nothing written on them. They were completely empty. He'd slide them through the slot in the mailbox on my door. So I had nicknamed him the Mailman. He was one of the strangest. Because if I tried to talk to him, I would see the outline of his face suddenly look up before he started knocking again. So I left him alone. Since that time, 20 years have passed, and I've tried to live as normal a life as possible. I have a lot of friends, and I'm even dating a girl I met last year. That's pretty good for a guy who wakes up in the middle of the night and hears noises and voices coming from the other side of his door. Yeah, my friends think I'm weird, but they accept me as I am. They're awesome, and I'm going to miss them. You see, strange things have started to happen. Well, even stranger than usual. 3 weeks ago, I woke up sweating and screaming. I didn't know exactly why. The only thing I remembered was that I was having a perfectly normal dream when a huge shadow fell over the place where I was. Literally, a second after I opened my eyes, I heard knocking on my bedroom door. They sounded really panicked. "Who's there?" I shouted.
Please help us!
I answered the voice, surprised to recognize the same sadistic, angry tone that had terrified me in the garden shed on my 7th birthday. But his tone sounded sincere. It was as if he was suffering, as if he had been seriously injured. I had never been tempted to open a door when those things were around. I guess that since I was a young child, I had convinced myself that the voices I heard had to be evil. But to be honest, that morning, I really struggled not to go and open it. But in the end, I didn't do it. Things got worse afterwards. Barely 2 days later, I was in a convenience store, open 24 hours. Just down my street, I had just bought a bottle of milk and the newspaper, when a superhuman force came crashing against the store's door. At the same moment, a voice let out a long, high-pitched scream of agony. I tried to see what was behind the door, but there were so many posters hanging on the glass. All my eyes could make out was the silhouette of a woman who was banging on it with the palm of her hand. I was petrified, and the store owner was looking at me like I was crazy. Finally, I asked him if there was a restroom I could use, pretending it was urgent. But in reality, I just wanted to hide there, until the screaming stopped. There have been 4 similar incidents between that moment and today. They could all be summed up as mixtures of screams and pleas. Yesterday, the one I called a mailman came by. He knocked politely before sliding his usual envelopes through the slot in the mailbox. He put one in, then another, then yet another, and in the end, I ended up with 10 brown envelopes. The mailman waited a few minutes, knocking occasionally, then he left me alone. Each letter only had an A4-sized sheet of paper. Looking at them, it seemed like someone had taken a black pen and scribbled on them with all their might. To leave huge tears in the center of the pages, I put each paper back in its envelope and tried to forget all about it. But just now, I heard a huge banging against the door. I didn't hear any screams, pleas, or growls. No, what I heard was crying. Dozens and dozens of voices softly sobbing in unison. The next moment, another violent blow struck my door. So hard that bits of paint peeled off the wall and fell to the floor. After that, the sobbing continued even louder. I got up from my chair. A small crack had appeared right in the middle of my door, and my phone started ringing. I answered, and on the other end of the line, I heard what I was hearing behind the door. Crying, lots of crying, but it sounded distorted, panicked, and terrified. I hung up, but the phone started ringing again. Again and again. So, I took out the battery. After that, I put as much furniture as I could in front of the door and the window. I was certain that my door wouldn't hold for very long. Because the way I barricaded myself was anything but safe, I felt like I could die at any moment. And that's when I started to question all of this. What exactly do they want from me? Do they really mean me harm? Maybe I should open the door. Maybe I should let them in. After that, I didn't hear anything anymore. There were no more knocks. Even the crying had stopped. I couldn't take it anymore, and was only looking forward to one thing. It was to escape this horrible situation. I wanted to get out and go outside, where there were no doors for those entities to knock on. I pushed the furniture and turned the handle. Only it was locked, so I got down on my knees and I looked through the keyhole behind the door. There wasn't the hallway I remembered, but another room that looked like some kind of classroom or a library. Inside, there was only one child, sitting with his back to me, and he seemed to be reading something. I knocked on the door. "Hey kid, can you let me out, please?" He turned slightly. "Yes, look, I'm right here." "Can you open the door for me?" He answered that he couldn't, that he was in detention. He wasn't supposed to talk to anyone. He turned away from me again. Disturbed and exasperated, I got up, and then I heard a faint noise coming from my window this time. There was nothing frantic about it. I didn't know why, but I knew that whatever was behind the window wasn't even trying to get in. That thing was trying to scare me by showing me that it knew I was there, and guess what? It worked. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting, "Kid, let me out, okay? I really need you to open this door." The American dream means something different to everyone. For some it's about being successful and living in a huge house on a hill in California. Mine is simple, even if it's a bit stereotypical. My dream is to live in a suburb, a quiet life with my family, surrounded by very few neighbors. Our house was on the edge of the city, and our street was filled with pleasant people. My family and I quickly became friends with all our neighbors. After we moved in, our house was located in front of a dense forest full of tall trees. It was really beautiful, and it matched exactly what I had dreamed of. The first week we spent in this house was amazing. We had installed new electric fences so that our dog Smokey could run freely and play with my children outside. I know what you're probably thinking about electric fences, but it was mainly for his safety. In America, if a dog bites someone, even by accident, a passerby on the street, it risks immediate euthanasia, so it was a necessary evil. Sometimes the children would go into the forest with Smokey and play fetch with him using a stick. Watching Smokey search the bushes made them laugh. I always warned them not to go too far into the forest to avoid getting lost. But then, on the 8th day after we moved in, something strange happened. To my dismay, my children tried to play with Smokey in the forest. But when he got to the edge, he refused to go any further. He was terrified, and he kept whining. The children tugged his collar, urging him to move away from the forest as quickly as possible. But the more they pulled, the more he resisted. So they brought him back to our yard and went into the forest alone. I went over to Smokey to see what was wrong. I knelt down next to him and looked in the direction he was staring. From where I was, unfortunately, I couldn't see anything. The day went on and I asked the kids to come back, because it was starting to get late, and then I sent them to bed. After reading them a few stories, then I went to bed myself next to my wife. I put my arms around her, and we soon fell asleep. Around 2 in the morning, a confusing noise woke me. I jumped out of bed, and I started going down the stairs toward the noise, which was getting louder and louder. It sounded like an animal was dying, and it was coming from the forest just behind the house. It didn't really sound like the cry of any animal I knew, and from what I could hear, whatever was screaming sounded like it was in terrible pain. It even seemed like it was dying slowly. The screams didn't stop and were actually getting louder. Each scream was louder than the last, and it gave me goosebumps. Suddenly my heart started beating really fast, and a feeling of imminent danger came over me, and the screams suddenly stopped. It was sad to think that a poor animal had probably just died, but strangely, afterwards, I felt a sense of relief. Its screams tortured my ears. I tried to forget what I just heard. I shook my head and went back to bed. The next morning, I told my wife what had happened. She told me that even though it was sad for the animal in question, I shouldn't think too much about it. It was around noon when I went out with the kids and Smokey. I decided to go with them to the forest, but once again, the dog stopped at the edge. This time, he started barking loudly, so I decided to go see why. But I didn't see anything, even after looking for signs of any animal. As I was starting to head back home, I told the kids that, in the end, they couldn't go play in the forest. But my wife protested and insisted that I should stop worrying and being paranoid. The next day, my eldest son John came to tell me while he was playing outside that he had heard a child screaming in the woods. It was strange because the screams I had personally heard didn't sound like a child's screams at all. My ears could have played tricks on me, but to me, it was clearly an animal. I was almost certain of it. 2 days after that, Smokey had disappeared. There was no trace of him anymore, and no one had seen him since the previous night. I started to worry more and more because of the recent events. Even though it had only been a few nights since I last heard those horrible screams, I told myself that with a bit of luck, whatever had been screaming in the forest was gone. Around midnight, I woke up and found my other son, Mike, standing in front of my bed with a look of frozen horror on his face. He asked me if he could sleep with us, between my wife and me, and I asked him what had scared him so much that he wanted to sleep with us. He told me that when he woke up with a start, he saw from his bed the silhouette of a child in the garden, but the child in question was walking like a dog on all fours, and when Mike saw him, the child started running into the woods. And a few seconds later, Mike heard screams. Of course, I told Mike he could stay and sleep with us, and that he shouldn't worry. That night, I stayed awake all night, hoping to hear something that would answer the questions I was asking myself. After a long time in perfect silence, I started to fall asleep, when suddenly the silence was interrupted. New screams could be heard. I went into my garage to grab my rifle and a flashlight. Then I ran towards the woods. As I continued, the screams grew louder and seemed to come closer. My heart was pounding and cold sweat was running all over my body. Just as I neared the source of the scream, everything stopped. The sudden silence was really stressful, and my heart started pounding even harder against my chest. With incredible speed, I ran toward the house. The more I ran, the more scared I became. The distance to my house seemed way too long. I even felt like I was going in the wrong direction. I kept running and running, and yet I couldn't find the edge of the woods. And suddenly, I heard barking behind me. And as you can imagine, it was Smokey. I ran in his direction shouting his name, but I couldn't find him. And once again, just when I thought I was really close to the barking, it stopped. I couldn't take it anymore and started running in the opposite direction. Until I came across something that today I can only describe as a monstrosity. This thing was about my height. Its skin was so pale that it shone brightly despite the faint moonlight. The creature was standing in a strange way, as if it were hunched, deformed, twisted. All of that at once. But what shocked me the most was its face, which looked strangely like mine. It was an absolutely horrible version of my face. Its mouth was huge. It had huge teeth that looked like they could tear through metal. It had so many tongues that I didn't even bother trying to count them. Its eyes, it didn't have any. Instead, there were two small yellow lights, like two car headlights piercing through the dark night. At that moment, the thing dropped back onto its hands and knees, and it started crawling toward me at an alarming speed. I dropped my weapon, so sudden was my fright. And I started running in the opposite direction again. I was running as fast as humanly possible. I wanted to get out of those woods at any cost to escape that monstrous thing. I could hear that it was right next to me, and I let out screams of panic, praying that someone would hear me. But at the same moment, I realized something horrible. So horrible that my stomach hurt. The screams I heard in the woods, from the very beginning, were my own screams. That thing could imitate voices, and it wasn't surprising, since it could also imitate facial features. Those screams my children had heard were probably their own, and what Mike saw was almost certainly that monster. While I was thinking about that, I didn't stop running. I decided to quickly look behind me, but I didn't see the creature. And instead of reassuring me, it chilled me to the bone even more. I was exhausted from the hellish run I had just done, so I stopped for a moment. But the sound of a branch breaking not far behind me made me start running again even faster. How long had I been running? Where was the edge of the woods? I just wanted to go home and leave with my family, as far from that thing as possible. Sadly, nothing in this forest felt familiar anymore. The further I went, the more I realized that I would probably never leave these woods again. But just as I felt my fate was sealed, I found the edge of the forest again. I ran toward the house and burst inside. My wife hurried down the stairs, panicked because of the noise I made at the entrance. I made up a heavy excuse for her. I said I heard the dog barking outside and chased it for nearly an hour. I didn't want my children to know such a monstrosity existed. Then, my wife went back to bed while I stayed there watching the front door of the house. We couldn't afford to move, so afterwards I installed budget cameras all around the house. I wanted to be able to constantly keep an eye on what was happening outside, day and night. Of course, my children were forbidden from going near the forest, and considering how much Mike's story and Smokey's disappearance had scared them, they didn't even need that ban to stay away from the forest. It's been a few days since it happened, and sometimes I still hear screams coming from that cursed forest. Thinking back, I should have followed my own advice from the start instead of foolishly rushing in. You should never go too deep into the woods if you don't want to get lost. It began on August 3, 1999. My family had just moved into a colonial house that was built in 1853. The house was in one of the first community subdivisions in northern New Hampshire, and since my father was a big history enthusiast, he fell in love with the house as soon as he saw the commemorative emblem on the side of the house. Apart from my father, no one really knew what made this house so special, except for its age. But to be honest, it's true that the property was beautiful, and my mother and my father wholeheartedly agreed to pay the $550,000, which, for a house like that, was not an exorbitant price at all. I'd always been a rather shy child, especially because I was quite overweight, so I wasn't very sociable and I didn't know many people. It was my fourth move since starting school. I didn't see the point in making friends if I just have to leave them soon after. Overall, the first few weeks in that place were pretty pleasant. I enjoyed exploring my neighborhood, finding new spots near home, playing with local animals, and was known as the nice kid in the community. I wasn't used to getting so much attention, and feeling this sudden wave of appreciation was quite nice for me. After a few weeks, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. I searched every corner trying to find old books, spiders, and all sorts of other weird things. I found some old coins, a few corners that no one had noticed, and other discoveries that weren't important. But the thing that really caught my attention was the hidden door I discovered in the kitchen. I didn't want to tell anyone about my discovery. The door was hidden behind the fridge that was already here when we moved in, and I discovered it after I managed to push the fridge with all my strength. That day, since I wasn't alone, I quickly put the fridge back in its place. The next day, the house was empty for a few hours. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. So, I just examined it. It looked much older than the rest of the house. There was a knocker instead of a handle, and the door was made of extremely thick wood. I kept examining it for a moment, then I put the fridge back in place just before my parents came home. Luckily, they told me that night they were going out again for dinner. They trusted me to stay home alone, making it the perfect chance to solve the mystery of the door and try to see what was hiding behind it. So, as soon as they left, I got to work. My parents loved watching crime shows and movies, and in them, there were always scenes that explained how to pick a lock. Just like in the movies, I tried unlocking the door by sliding a plastic card into the slot, but it didn't work. Then I went to get a big pin and stuck it into the lock, and after 10 minutes, I was extremely frustrated with my failure. So, I grabbed a knife and shoved it into the lock with all my strength. And by some miracle, the door opened after that. It creaked as I pushed it open. A smell started to fill the kitchen, growing stronger and stronger as I pushed the door. I couldn't really describe that smell, but let's just say it was a strong musty odor. Even though the kitchen was perfectly lit, what was behind the door was completely dark. It was a bit like that room was absorbing the light and making it disappear completely. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into that secret room. In the abyss of darkness, I could see some stairs in bad shape, with a broken handrail. In the distance, I could barely make out a dilapidated floor that seemed to be stained with something. But I wasn't sure. I felt a sense of unease and anxiety as the energy of the room seeped into me. Something told me to turn back and run, but I had already gone way too far. Terrified and on my guard, I took my first step into this abyss of darkness that would soon become my new home. Each step made the stairs move, making me realize the termite-eaten staircase was likely unstable, and it was very likely that the wood would give way and that I would get hurt falling, or even worse. But I was determined to keep going. So I ran down the stairs, literally jumping onto the cold floor. I swept the room with my flashlight, and to my great astonishment, the room looked particularly elegant. The floor was entirely made of marble. The walls were adorned with beautiful paintings. Drapes hung from the ceiling, and the entire room was gilded. Besides the paintings, the beautiful room was empty. For some reason, it reminded me of an old hair salon or something similar. It looked strangely beautiful. I noticed there was a hallway in the corner of the room, so I walked in that direction. As soon as I reached the passage, I noticed a drastic change in the quality of the decoration. The hallway was just grey. There were exposed stones and no decoration. My legs started to tremble, and I really wanted to turn back, but I couldn't. It was like I knew I had something to do there. I started to go deeper into the hallway. At first it was spacious, but the further I went, the smaller and narrower it became. It seemed like it was collapsing in on itself. But I was too curious, because this passage probably held treasures. Ancient relics, or things even more interesting. I had to find out for sure. Just as I was starting to think the tunnel was becoming impassable, because the corridor was getting way too narrow, I suddenly arrived in a huge room. About 50 square meters. The room was scary. There were spider webs filled with eggs. The cockroaches looked gigantic, and the walls were stained and cracked. In one spot, 3 cracks side by side looked like claw marks, and at the very end of the room, in the center of the wall, there was a large picture frame. As I moved toward the frame, I became more and more terrified. But I finally had the courage to point my flashlight directly at it. I felt like my heart was going to stop instantly when I saw what was on it. The photo showed a woman who appeared brutally tortured and beaten, with a macabre smile on her face. Because of the cuts at the corners of her lips, which went all the way up to her ears, she no longer had a left eye, and her hair had been burned. And her upper lip had been cut. It revealed all of her gums. Her entire face was covered in blood cuts and bruises. What was most disturbing, however, was her skin. It had different shades. It was a mix between a pinkish shade and a greenish shade, which looked like rot. It looked like she had caught some kind of fungus, and that fungus had severely attacked her skin. Various abscesses were on her skin, which looked like they were decomposing. She had a cut on the side of her neck that went down to her chest. And as I got closer, I saw that it was a scarification. A message left with a knife. It said, "I am trash." No matter which way I moved, the lady's single eyes seemed to follow my every movement. Horrified and panicked, I ran out of the room. I quickly crossed the hallway and entered the pretty room, and I went up the stairs before slamming the door behind me. I put the fridge back in place and felt like I was being followed. And, in a way, I was right, because I realized that one of the spider webs was stuck in my hair, and about 50 baby spiders, freshly hatched from their eggs, were crawling on top of my head. I immediately grabbed an insect spray and sprayed it on my head before going to wash my hair. Shortly after that, my parents came home. They asked me what I had done, and I just told them that I had read a book, walked around the neighborhood, and played with some of my neighbors. After that, I quickly went to bed, but I couldn't fall asleep right away, and I tossed and turned in my bed over and over before finally falling asleep. The next days passed as usual, and the terror of that night gradually faded. I began spending more time playing with neighborhood kids or walking alone to avoid being at home. I had even forgotten what the woman in the photo looked like, as if none of it had ever happened. One day, I showed the house to a friend, and he was amazed. And he looked at every little thing, as if everything was wonderful. And after we finished touring the house, he went into the kitchen so we could have something to drink. Too tired to follow him, I just stayed and looked out the living room window. But suddenly, I heard him shout that he had found a door. He hadn't even finished his sentence when I already heard the sound of the fridge scraping against the floor. I shouted to tell him to stop, but it was too late. He was too fast and was already almost at the bottom of the stairs. I followed him. He was amazed by the beauty of the lovely room that appeared before him. He viewed the paintings and began acting like he was in an old movie. But I was starting to feel anxious again. I really didn't like being here. I told him we should go back upstairs, and he listened to me. When we got to the top of the stairs, I noticed he had a piece of paper in his hand. He must have grabbed it before I came into the room. I asked him for the paper. I opened it and saw that it was a handwritten estimate for an unbreakable window, cement and bricks. And then I noticed that there was a sentence right at the bottom of the estimate. It was written, "Now that bitch will never get out of here again. She will stay mine." I couldn't hide that from my parents, and as soon as I told them, they called the police. The police came and searched the room thoroughly, and after a long search they found the corpse of a woman who had been tortured, brutalized, and hanged with a rope. She was behind an unbreakable window, because yes, in the room with the cobwebs, there had never been a picture frame. Because what I saw earlier was only the outline of the window, and so what I was seeing behind it was the tortured and disfigured woman who was staring straight into my eyes. Before I start telling you this story, I need to put things into context, because that's really important. My name is Pierre, I'm 31 years old, and I've been blind since I was 12. My blindness appeared suddenly, brutally, as a result of an operation that unfortunately went wrong. My parents didn't immediately realize that I was having a vitreous hemorrhage, which inevitably led to a delay in diagnosis, and so, as a result, to this operation that took away my sight. Since that day, I can't see anything at all. Actually, what's closest to reality, at least, is that I see black. Absolutely everything is black. There are shades of grey that sometimes break up all this monotony. That's especially rare for me. Living with this disability was hard, as everything got more complicated. I knew I would never see my favorite cartoon again, nor the flowers that my mum watered every Saturday in our garden, or even my dad's awful plaid shirt. The colors had disappeared, and my joy for life disappeared with them. But if I'm here telling you my story, it's because, despite these tragedies, I managed to get back on my feet. Little by little, I learned to adapt to my blindness. I learned to live again, appreciate my other senses, and truly embrace life. Now, I read differently than you do. Since losing my sight, my touch has become more precise, and my hearing has improved, to the point where I can hear all the little nuances in a piece of music. And as for my other senses, they've also become much more sensitive. I truly began living again at 20. After 8 difficult years of trying to rediscover joy, I finally escaped that terrible hell, at the cost of many years of rehabilitation. By the time I was 30, I had even become what you might call someone who enjoys life. Everything was going very well, perfectly well even, until the day I saw that horrible face for the first time. Yes, you heard me right, I saw a face. I was on the couch, letting my fingers run over a few lines I was reading. I read a lot about animals, so much that I can spend hours researching a single species for an entire afternoon. Even though I'm blind and just sitting on my couch, my eyes still move a lot, even when I'm doing nothing special. And when I looked up, where my stereo was placed, I saw something. It was a kind of very bright, oval-shaped spot, hard to describe. The only thing I could make out for sure was 2 other dark shapes. Inside that very spot, I immediately knew at that moment that they were black eyes, perfectly black. You know, it often happens that blind people see things. Actually, there's even a name for it. Charles Bonnet syndrome. If you've lost your sight, this can happen to you in your life. Only if you've lost it and you're not born blind, for example. Being blind myself, I immediately thought of this syndrome, so I moved my head and my eyes to confirm that it was indeed a hallucination. But when I did that, the face didn't move, and it stayed close to where the stereo was, as if it was really in the room with me. Even worse, I couldn't see it when I closed my eyes. At that moment, I felt such intense fear that I almost dropped what I was reading. My hands started to tremble. As I stared at the face intently, I hesitated for a moment before opening my mouth. But since I was alone, I told myself that it would confirm that none of this was real. So I asked out loud, "Who are you?" The very second the words left my mouth, the blurry face suddenly turned toward me. The blurry, dark circles that served as its eyes were now fixed in my direction. I immediately ran to the next room and closed the door behind me, and I dialed a close friend's number so they could come to my place urgently. I was in an absolutely horrible state of panic. My body started trembling on its own. I felt oppressed, trapped. But the worst part was the feeling of impending death that I felt while staring at that blurry thing in what seemed to be its eyes. When my friend arrived, the first thing she did was comfort me by holding me in her arms. I immediately explained everything to her in detail. At first, Jennifer was quite puzzled and even thought I was telling her a very bad joke. But quickly, she started to take it more seriously and listen to me carefully. Shortly after, she said,
You know,
Those things you see? It's not really real.
Jen, I assure you it was there. When I closed my eyes, it disappeared. When I moved my eyes, the thing stayed put, as if standing right next to the stereo.
So then, who says it's really real? It's literally impossible. You know that, right? Did you consider talking to your psychiatrist first?
Jen was still the nicest girl I've ever known. At that very moment, I felt terribly alone. There was no way she could know exactly how I felt when I saw that horror, when that thing laid its eyes on me. So I listened to her wise advice and I called my doctor. After I explained everything that happened to me, he asked an interesting question. He thought it could only be mental. I had to check my living room to see if the hallucination was still there. After our conversation, I hung up. Then I gathered my courage and opened the door that led to the living room. As soon as I cracked the door open, I saw him. He was still there, only something had changed. His face was no longer as blurry, even though the darkness all around him made it hard to describe. Simply put, it was just a face floating in the air. I couldn't make out his legs or his arms, just his terrible face. His mouth was half open and no teeth could be seen. His eyes, perfectly black, didn't move an inch. The face was completely motionless, even though it only took up a small part of the darkness, that is my vision. He was omnipresent in my mind, and just as I was about to close the door to call my psychiatrist again, the thing started to move. His face was shaking in every direction, like a glitched video would, and then, without warning, the face just rushed straight at me. And for the very first time, I heard something come out of his mouth, a scream so horrible that it paralyzed me on the spot. I slammed the door shut so fast that the movement made me stumble backward. Then, I dropped to my knees on the floor and cried for a long time. Never did I think that one day I could see something new again. I had been in that thick black smoke since I was 12 years old, in which I had somehow become entangled, and without warning, this horror became visible to my eyes. Seeing something again had never seemed as terrifying to me as it did at that moment. In the following days, I had several therapy sessions. The therapist prescribed antidepressants and anxiolytics, but I didn't take them, because I knew it. What I was seeing was truly alive. For several days now, I've been trying to escape it by any means possible. Her presence terrifies and paralyzes me, making me feel vulnerable. So, by any means, I tried to get as far away from her as possible, but I realized that it was impossible to escape from her. Now, I can see her face even in the people who offer me hospitality. I see it much more clearly now. I can even see the deep wrinkles just below her eyes. More and more, he is getting closer to me. At first, I saw him as if he was only a few meters away, but for the past 2 days, I have been hearing him. The only way I've found to stop seeing him is to close my eyes, but I have no way to stop hearing him breathe darkly once night falls. Even earplugs can't block out that sound. It's like it echoes in my head non-stop. When I saw him for the first time, I think he didn't know I could see him. I guess I was doomed the moment our eyes met for the first time. As I dictate these words to you, I only have a few seconds left before I open my eyes so I don't completely lose my mind. Because I have to face him, that I find a way to make him disappear, because this thing that was not supposed to be seen undoubtedly wants to remain what it is, an evil that cannot be seen but that truly exists. I'm desperately trying to forget an image. From time to time, this image still manages to reappear, and I can see the horrible face of that thing again. In those moments, my limbs freeze and I feel my throat tighten as the memories rush in to haunt me. No matter how hard I try to forget, I can't erase the memory of the pure evil I encountered. I raised my children alone because my wife died in a car accident. She was hit by a drunk driver who had just run a red light. At that time, my daughter Elizabeth was 7 years old and my son Nicholas was 4. And to this day, the biggest challenge I had to face was having to tell them that their mother would not be coming back. Even the day after her funeral, he looked for her in the house, expecting to see her appear from behind a curtain, as if she had simply been playing hide and seek. I think it was because they were so young and their minds couldn't process the loss of their mother at that time. It was as if they just didn't want to believe it. After receiving the money from her life insurance, I decided that we needed to move to a different part of the city. I wanted the kids to stay at the same school and keep their friends. But I couldn't stand all the memories of the many moments we had lived in that house. There wasn't a night that went by without me crying myself to sleep, my hand resting on my wife's side of the bed, which was now empty. It took months, but we eventually adapted. Sometimes as they played in the garden, I found myself staring at my wife's portrait on the mantelpiece. I found myself smiling with tears on my cheeks, not from sadness, but happiness. I had accepted she was in a better place and that our lives would gradually improve. Except that everything really changed the day I saw that thing behind our house. When we moved, I found a house that was located on the outskirts of the city. It was in a cul-de-sac right across from one of my children's friends' houses. So it was a perfect place for them, but also for me, because I needed to be a little bit isolated. Of course, I still invited my friends over for a drink from time to time, but I have to admit that I love sitting alone on the porch overlooking the garden, watching the birds fly away from the surrounding trees that stretched as far as the eye could see and made me feel like the master of a gigantic estate that started in the garden. But one day, while I was sitting in my chair, a bottle of beer in one hand and a book in the other, I heard Elizabeth, my daughter, calling me from the end of the garden. When I asked her what she wanted, she turned to me, her eyes wide open. She pointed her finger with a trembling hand toward the forest. I squinted to see what she was pointing at but saw nothing, so I set down my beer and book, and I crossed the garden to go join my daughter. I put my hand on her shoulder before taking her in my arms, to comfort her as best as I could. "Why are you so scared, sweetheart? Did you see a fox or something like that?" With her arms still around me, she was trembling violently, and she kept pointing with her finger. I glanced in the direction she was showing me until my eyes stopped on a large oak tree that was about 2 meters from where we were standing. The scattered leaves on its branches had changed color, and most of them had fallen, and they had piled up around the trunk. Beneath the roots that stretched into the ground, I spotted a hole. I'd seen this tree before, but never noticed an animal live beneath it. "My dear, I can't help if you don't tell me what's wrong. So, I'm going to ask you again. What did you see?" Elizabeth took a deep breath and answered in a trembling voice.
That...
I looked again toward the big oak tree, and I saw a hand covered in grey skin coming out of the hole underneath it. Long fingers with yellow nails were digging deep into the earth. Suddenly, I heard the creature the hand belonged to scream deeply as it pulled itself from the hole. As its limbs became clearer, I noticed how frail it was, its thin muscles contracting under pale skin in a last effort to escape the hole. The disgusting creature then raised its head toward the bright light of the autumn sun, and I was able to see its face for the first time. Its eyes were sunken into their sockets, and its cheeks seemed hollow, so much so that its skin looked stretched over the bones of its skull. The whites of its eyes were streaked with red veins that would disappear from time to time when its half-torn eyelids closed. Greasy grey hair hung down both sides of its face and the back of its neck. The vertebrae of its spine pressed against its skin, as if they were about to break through. It was almost grotesque when the creature moved. I stood still, completely shocked. I could no longer hear the birds singing, or even the wind blowing through the branches of the trees. The only sound I could hear was its weak, raspy breathing, which came from its throat, like a croak. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was gripping my t-shirt tightly. I could feel her trembling, as if she was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear her. And suddenly, my ears were filled with a piercing scream that came straight from the creature's body. As the thing kept screaming, its body started moving violently, and its limbs started flailing in a supernatural way. To this day, I still don't know what made me grab my daughter and run, but I'm grateful that something managed to snap me out of my stupor. I ran so fast that I was inside the house in a matter of seconds. I closed the door behind me and locked my windows, keeping my eyes on the thing crawling in our yard. I told my daughter to get my rifle from my bedroom. She came back quickly, the weapon firmly gripped in her small hands. I grabbed it and took off the safety. I aimed in the direction of the creature, ready to empty my magazine on it. While I stayed on guard, I told my daughter to call the police and ask them to send officers. 2 police cars arrived in under 10 minutes. I chose this house partly because the police station was nearby. As I followed 2 officers to the end of my yard, all 3 of us had our weapons in hand, while one of their colleagues stayed with my daughter. Even though they approached the tree without much hesitation, I kept my distance because I knew what was in that hole. Their weapons were aimed at the gaping cavity. One of them took out his flashlight, then pointed it toward the darkness. And when they looked inside, they found nothing. They inspected every inch of the burrow with the flashlight, but it was empty. There was no sign of what Elizabeth and I had seen. I started to panic, thinking they would believe I was trying to play a bad joke on them. However, they just told me to keep an eye out and stay cautious in case the creature came back. And if that happened, I should call them immediately. They also recommended that I keep a camera with me so I could film the thing if it came back. And after reassuring my daughter, they left. I'm convinced that the reason they didn't ask any questions was because they remembered that my wife had died a few months earlier. They must have thought that I was still grieving, and that all of this was just a manifestation of that. 4 years went by without me seeing that thing again, and when it unfortunately reappeared, it was in a dramatic way. My daughter had just turned 11, and I had allowed her to invite some friends over for a sleepover, so that she and her friends would be comfortable. I had taken the trouble to push all the living room furniture to one side, so they would have enough space to lay out their sleeping bags. I told Elizabeth that I preferred they sleep inside, as some people reportedly saw coyotes nearby. But I knew she didn't believe me, and that she knew exactly why I didn't want her to stay alone with her friends in our backyard, and she had no objection to it. While I spent the night with my son Nicholas watching movies, I occasionally heard the girls laughing and chatting happily. After the last movie ended, I put Nicholas to bed. And then I poked my head through the living room door to check that the girls were okay. They were all sleeping. They were arranged so that there was a lantern at their feet. Tired myself, I went up to my room and fell asleep. I don't know how much time passed before I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and my little girl's scream. Instinctively, I grabbed my rifle and I ran down the stairs. When I got to the living room, I saw that the sleeping bags were empty and all the girls were huddled in a corner. Their lantern was next to them, all of them, except my daughter. "Elizabeth, what happened, damn it?" I shouted at them, looking at the broken window. But I didn't get any answer. It looked like it had been broken from the outside. I turned back to the girls, who were huddled in the corner, and I saw that they were all pointing toward the window. At that moment, I was overwhelmed by a sense of imminent danger. I felt like throwing up, and my mind quickly came to the conclusion that the thing was back. I ran as fast as I could to the back door, and I opened it. As I sprinted through the yard, I shouted to the girls to call the police. My bare feet pounded the ground as I rushed to the forest's edge. When I finally got there, I felt the bottom of my pants was soaked and full of mud. I cupped my hands around my mouth to shout my daughter's name, and the only response I got was the echo of my trembling voice. I took a deep breath, and I was about to shout her name again, but I was stopped in my tracks. Crawling under a bush, a few meters away from me, I saw the face I hadn't seen in years. Lit by the rays of the moon, I saw her dig her claws into the ground to crawl completely out from under the bush. With every movement he made, I could hear his bones cracking ominously. This creature had taken my daughter, and there was only one thing I wanted. It was to catch him, to strangle him, and to watch the life slowly fade from his eyes. The only problem was that I couldn't, no matter how much I wanted to. I couldn't move anymore. Compared to the hatred I felt for that beast, my fear took over and wouldn't let me make a move. Slowly, its mouth opened to reveal sharp teeth stained with a brown substance. The creature let out a deep breath, which filled the air around me with a horrible smell of rot and decay. I wanted to pinch my nose, but even that I couldn't do. And then, the creature started making a strange noise. It sounded like it was rumbling deep in its belly, and the sound slowly rose until the monstrosity let out a deep croak. The sound kept increasing before reaching its peak, and so high-pitched that I thought my eardrums were going to burst. I finally managed to move and put my hands over my ears and close my eyes. But even so, I had the feeling that the sound was echoing inside my head. When the thing finally stopped screaming, I lowered my hands and opened my eyes again. The creature had disappeared. There was no trace of its presence. The ground where that thing had crawled earlier was completely spotless. I kept staring at the ground, and I don't know how long I stood there. It took the intervention of 3 police officers to bring me back to reality. When I was finally able to look away from where the beast had been before, I screamed. I fell to my knees, and I cried with all my strength. I punched the ground. I tore out grass, expecting the officers to pick me up. but they let me go on. It was about a week before they found his body. The body of my little girl was found a kilometer from our house, well hidden in the forest. Even though I couldn't go there to see the crime scene, the police gave me a description. They found her under a thin layer of dried leaves, her clothes completely torn. My little girl had been tortured by that monster. That funeral was one of the hardest days of my life. While everyone was crying under the freezing November rain, I remained silent and expressionless. As I looked at her little coffin, the despair I felt didn't allow me to cry. No matter how much I wanted to, I just couldn't. My eyes were as dry as my heart and soul. On each of her birthdays, I always visit her grave, and I only do it on that day. It always hurts me to see her name on that grey stone. There isn't a single photo of her anywhere in my house. Seeing her, even in a picture, brings me to my knees and makes me cry my heart out. I still have pictures of my wife, but it's not the same, because when the drunk man who killed her was sentenced to life in prison, I was able to grieve. But with Elizabeth, it was different. The creature that attacked her was still at large. The thing that killed her was still crawling in the woods. The pictures of Elizabeth are carefully stored in a box that I put in the attic until I find that thing. I don't think I could bear to see her face. I feel like I abandoned her. By not being able to kill that thing that night, my fear got the better of me, and it still haunts me today. I'm not sure I can stop that thing on my own, but I'll do my best. Nicholas is grown up now. He went to college and got his degree in mechanical engineering. Shortly after that, he found a girlfriend and married her. They had a child a few years later. And to this day, I don't let my granddaughter, who was named Elizabeth in honor of my daughter, come visit me because I'm afraid that thing might reappear if she comes to see me. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I feel like I hear something coming from the woods, a faint sound, but persistent. That's exactly the sound that terrible thing made. Have you ever, during the night, felt like you were being watched? Felt like you were being spied on, even though there was no one else in the room but you? Sometimes you might also feel a draft, a breath on the back of your neck, or maybe a small unusual noise that wakes you up in the middle of the night. I know where that comes from. I know who's doing all this. I called him the man of the night. One night, after a party at some friend's place, with plenty of drinks, I went to bed pretty late. It must have been around 2 in the morning, I don't remember exactly. I was exhausted and had so much alcohol in my blood that I collapsed into bed, and I fell asleep pretty quickly. I was woken up shortly after because I thought I heard someone whispering my name. Arthur. I opened my eyes and instantly felt like someone was watching me, sending chills down my spine. I scanned the room, dimly lit by the moonlight coming from outside. But there was nothing, so I quickly put it into perspective. I was still drunk, half asleep. It was likely just my imagination or a dream. So I closed my eyes, intending to fall back asleep quickly, but then, after barely 10 minutes, I felt someone sit at the end of my bed. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt the sheets being pulled down, and I very clearly heard the sound of the mattress sinking at the end of the bed. I could have almost sworn I felt a weight on my feet. I jumped violently and quickly fumbled for my bedside lamp, but just before I found it, I heard it again, very close this time, right next to my ear.
Go back to sleep.
There was no one in the room. I was alone. I rubbed my head, yet I was certain I felt something at my bed's end and heard someone whisper in my ear. But there was nothing. I got up, still half dazed. I no longer intended to sleep now. I remember very clearly thinking that it was once again some kind of waking dream. I'm prone to sleep paralysis, so that thought was legitimate. Even if I wasn't really sleeping, it was entirely possible that I was somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. That could have caused it. But I couldn't explain the whispers. The whispers that I heard clearly while I was completely awake. But I quickly blamed it on the alcohol. I made myself 2 or 3 cups of coffee, and I waited for daylight. Then I fell asleep on the couch without thinking again about what I had just experienced. A week went by after that without anything happening. A week where I was able to sleep properly, even though the feeling of being watched was still there. A week of calm until that night. When he showed up again, this time I hadn't drunk anything. I hadn't even had a drink all week. I went to bed around 10 o'clock. And once again, it was around 2 in the morning that I woke up. I don't know what woke me, but I immediately scanned the room with my eyes. And there, between the bars, at the end of my bed, I saw his face. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move an inch. He had a white face, tinged with a dark blue, like the skin of a corpse. He had no eyes. In their place were 2 gaping holes, completely empty. His mouth pulled into a particularly frightening grimace, as if immense rage inhabited him, after seconds that felt like hours. I was finally able to move. I pulled my feet back, and at the same moment, the creature slipped under the bed with incredible speed. I had time to hear it scratching against the slats of my bed frame. Just before I reached the bedside lamp switch, after turning it on, the whole room is plunged into a deadly silence again. I was sweating, my heart beating fast. Completely panicked, I got up with difficulty. Quickly moving away from the bed, I went to get my baseball bat that was placed between my wardrobe and the wall. I grabbed it firmly, but I was shaking with panic, and then I shouted something like, "Get out from under there." I don't remember exactly, but I felt that there was no one there, that I was alone once again. From a distance, I bent down to look under the bed. I was way too scared to get closer, and just as I expected, there was no one there. No creature, no monster was under there. I searched the wardrobe, every other room in the house, but there was nothing. Once again, I couldn't sleep that night. So I stayed up and watched my favorite show, finally falling asleep around 6 in the morning, baseball bat in hand. The very next day, I searched online for information about disorders that could cause hallucinations in the middle of the night. But apart from sleep paralysis, or even night terrors, which can be triggered by taking certain medications, I didn't find anything concrete. None of that applied to me, yet I saw it and I felt it. I questioned myself, wondering how to prove this wasn't just my imagination, and found only one way to check. So I carefully slid under the bed in broad daylight to check the slats of my bed frame. Since the creature had scratched them, I thought it might have left some marks, and well, it had. 2 long deep scratches were on 2 of the slats of my bed frame. I crawled out from under the bed, nauseous, but again, I foolishly downplayed all of that. I told myself the marks were likely there before or appeared after I moved in. I still took the problem seriously and set up a camera, just like in Paranormal Activity, right in front of my bed. I slept for 2 days at some friend's place who lived right next to me, so I let the camera run for 2 whole nights, making sure to change the battery in between. Then I came back from my weekend, and I watched the tapes from both nights. Out of more than 16 hours of footage, there was nothing. The camera's microphone didn't even pick up the slightest sound, except for the constant ticking of my wall clock. I was really reassured then, since I always felt like I was being watched, spied on while I slept, who had experienced those horrible things. I was reassured to tell myself that it was all just my imagination. That very evening, I decided to sleep in my room again. Still, I left the camera running all night, just in case. I wasn't woken up that night. I was able to sleep peacefully and wake up feeling grey. So I made myself a coffee and decided to watch the whole videotape on my tablet. And what I saw chilled me to the bone. I had just set up my camera when he was already under the bed. I could clearly see a hand sticking out from under it, a hand with long, very thin fingers. Then I turned off the bedside lamp and fell asleep quickly. And then I saw it come out from under the bed. It stood up right above me, its head tilted forward, its face just a few centimeters from mine. I noticed that it had long hair, which was almost falling onto my face. It stayed there, standing next to me, leaning over my face, sometimes whispering incomprehensible things. Sometimes I would move in my sleep, like turning to the other side, for example, but it kept staring at me without moving an inch. It did that all night, for hours. Until around 6 in the morning, its head slowly turned toward the camera. I could clearly see its horrible grin, its eye sockets completely empty, then it slowly walked toward it. I could clearly see it getting closer and closer. I was about to turn off the tablet when it whispered this sentence.
"I'm watching all of you sleep."
And it slowly bent down until I couldn't see it on the camera anymore. I saw myself yawning, waking up just a few minutes later. Then the video stopped by itself. I was still in shock from what I had just seen, but I had to put this video on a USB drive. So I wanted to copy everything, to show it to someone I know, maybe see someone who specializes in ghosts or something like that. But the file was corrupted. I couldn't open it anymore. Even worse, the original file from the camera also had a problem. The screen was black, silently, as if all proof of his existence vanished. If I'm telling you this today, it's because of the sentence he whispered in the video. He clearly said, "I'm watching you all sleep," and that made me realize something. At least that's what I think. I was lucky, or rather, the misfortune, to realize its presence. I think that's why it appears more often, that it's not afraid to show itself to me. That's why, by the way, I'm telling you all this. If one night you hear whispers in your sleep, or if you feel a cold breath, if you feel like you're being watched, above all, don't open your eyes, keep them closed. Ignore it. Because if you open them, if you try to look for it, you will definitely find it. And then, it won't hesitate to show itself to you anymore. And it will be there every night, watching you sleep.
I'm watching all of you sleep.
I'll be direct with you. I'm gonna ask you a question at the end of my story. It's a difficult question to answer, but I wouldn't ask you if I could answer it myself. I really need you to answer me, because honestly, I don't know what to do. Before I get all mixed up, let me tell you everything from the beginning. After college, I moved out of my home, about 20 hours away from my old place, to another state, to be more precise, more than 1,500 kilometers away from my closest family. I didn't do that because of a bad family relationship. Actually, it was quite the opposite. They had always supported me in my decisions and choices, and I think the reason for my move was simply that I wanted to be more independent. I'm not proud to admit it, but my family and I were so close that I felt like I was suffocating. I wanted to accomplish something without feeling like it was handed to me on a silver platter. So I left without looking back. The first few years went by without too many problems. I found an affordable apartment and a well-paying job and stayed in touch with my family, and I got used to my little life. But after a while, seeing them live their lives without me, I started to feel lonely. My brother had his graduation, and I couldn't even be there. I was working while my parents celebrated their 40th anniversary, and once again, I couldn't go to their party because I lived way too far away. But I think the last straw was my sister's pregnancy and the birth of my nephew. I was at work when I got the message. I don't think it was because I got the good news a few hours later than everyone else, but rather the fact that I received the news by text and that they didn't even bother to call me. It felt so distant and impersonal. For the first time, I really felt excluded from my own family. That's when I started to wonder if I had made the right decision by moving so far away from my family. One of the gifts my sister received was a baby monitor. We had all chipped in to buy it because it was a really good baby monitor. It even had a built-in webcam, which allowed you, with a password, to watch live what was happening in the baby's room. I wasn't a fan of this concept, but my sister was excited to share her moments with our family and friends. So she gave the password to our whole family and close friends. At first, I didn't use the password to watch my nephew, since my sister sent us lots of cute photos and videos, so I didn't see the point. Part of me found it really disturbing to have a baby's live stream accessible on the internet, and I liked even less the idea of having access to the privacy of my sister and her husband. Just imagining them trying to calm their baby in the middle of the night, without really knowing if someone was watching them or not. It gave me goosebumps. Like I told you, for the first few months, I didn't use the baby monitor's webcam, but I had some difficulties at work, and I started having pretty severe insomnia. So, after several weeks of not sleeping and tossing and turning in my bed over and over again, I decided to go see the doctor. He ran some tests but didn't find anything concerning. Unable to sleep, I started living at night, and that's when I started watching the live feed from my nephew's room. Before that, I had tried everything. I had tried to make my sleepless nights productive. I read books and watched classics. I even did things I normally didn't have time for during the day. But now, I had seen all the cult movies and read all the books I wanted to. If you're not a night owl, you'd be surprised to realize how there's nothing to do around 3 or 4 in the morning. At that hour, All my friends were asleep and I had no one to talk to, so I watched a live stream from my nephew. It was better than nothing. It's strange to say this, but watching something so small and precious sleeping calmed me. The problems I had at work and the feeling of being isolated from my family, all of that faded away as I watched that little angel sleeping so peacefully, and over time, it became my favorite thing to do. When I couldn't sleep, I listened to music, I read a little, and then I went to see what my little nephew was doing, and sometimes I even fell asleep in front of him. And then, the first time I saw that thing, it must have been about a month since I started having insomnia. It was a night like any other. I got off work, I watched a few movies, and then I turned on the live stream. And about an hour later, as I was starting to fall asleep, I saw it. My nephew was sleeping peacefully. The webcam was positioned above the crib, which allowed you to see inside, but also a small part of the wall next to it. There was no sound on the webcam, but my nephew moved slightly, as if something had disturbed his sleep. That thing stayed there for only a brief second, long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to conclude that it was just an optical illusion. I could have sworn I saw a head look inside the cradle, just before it disappears out of the camera's view. Since I was falling asleep, I rubbed my eyes and stared at the screen. For the next 10 minutes, I tried to spot what I had seen before, but nothing else happened. I scanned the screen for several more minutes, wondering what I had actually seen. Eventually, I concluded that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, and I went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I thought back to what I had seen and laughed, because it clearly looked like a hallucination. Due to my lack of sleep, I went on with my usual routine, ate something, and went to work. I came home very late that night. I was pretty sure that the stress I was experiencing at work was contributing to my inability to sleep. I logged into the webcam and started watching. I thought back to what I thought I saw the night before, but I quickly tried to put it out of my mind. After that, the nights went by without incident for me until the following week, when I saw the thing again. I was returning from a bar after having a few drinks with some coworkers. We had all had a bit too much. But luckily for me, the bar wasn't very far from my apartment. I somehow managed to make it home, and I sat down in front of my computer. I wasn't ready to go to bed yet, and honestly, the idea of going to bed and imagining everything spinning around me didn't really appeal to me. I checked my emails, and as usual, I started the live stream. It was at that exact moment that I was sure this thing really existed. The stream started just as that thing was crawling. On the wall opposite the baby's crib, it was small, ashen in color. Its limbs were thin and looked like they were sticking to the wall. It was moving slowly, as if trying not to make any noise. It was about a meter long, and its skin, if you could call it that, looked perfectly smooth. But on its chest, there were some kinds of bumps. The best way to describe this is that it would fit right into a twisted Stephen King dream. I panicked and immediately called my sister. There was clearly something in my nephew's room. I kept watching the screen as the thing turned its head toward my sister's room. In my opinion, it had heard the phone ring, and the next moment, the abomination had disappeared. My sister answered the phone, still half asleep and confused from being woken up after finally getting her baby to sleep. She instantly knew I was drunk by how I slurred my words, and she almost hung up. Before she understood what I was trying to tell her, I kept repeating a sentence like, "Something is in the baby's room." I heard her shake her husband and send him to check. I shouted at her to give him the phone before he went. I told him to look at the walls but also under the crib. He checked but he didn't find anything. When I asked him if there was anything at the foot of the crib, he sighed and told me there was a vent, but he doubted that anything could be under there. My brother-in-law handed the phone back to my sister, who now didn't look very happy to have been woken up in the middle of the night. For nothing, I lied, and I told her that I was sure I saw a rat crawling next to the crib. I had to lie to her, because if I had told her the truth, she would have thought I was completely crazy. She agreed to find a way to block the vent, just in case there really was a rodent. I spent the rest of the night watching my nephew sleep, and the thing didn't show up again that night. I decided that my only option was to catch that thing red-handed, and to take screenshots as evidence. It was the only way he'd believe me. I had to ensure my nephew was safe. Since it was the weekend, I had even more free time, so I slept during the day to be fully alert all night. I kept my phone next to me, and my fingers were on the keyboard, so I could take a screenshot the very moment that thing appeared. But that night, just like the ones that followed, I didn't see anything. So I took a day off, but that night, once again, nothing happened. I called my work the next day to tell them that once again, I wasn't coming in, but it was useless. Because once again, there was no sign of the creature. The third day I called my boss to tell him I needed one more day. He fired me. But I didn't care. The most important thing for me was to catch that thing so my nephew would be safe. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind after several nights without any results. Had I really seen something, or was I just completely burned out? But I didn't have to doubt myself for much longer, because the abomination made its final appearance. To be honest, I would have preferred to wonder all my life if I was crazy, rather than see that thing again. I was struggling to stay awake, and it was around 4 a.m. when it appeared again. I was paralyzed when I saw its limbs, looking like those of a spider, wrapping around the bars of the crib. The thing climbed to the highest point of the crib, and it started staring at my nephew while he was sleeping. I couldn't look away. Its face was similar to that of a human, but it didn't have a nose. My morbid fascination faded the moment the thing climbed down into my nephew's crib. I grabbed my cell phone and quickly looked up my sister's number. I pressed call and turned my attention back to the screen. Now, it was looming over my nephew like a spider about to descend on its prey, trapped in its web. The phone was ringing, and the thing was moving its limbs along its own chest. Why wasn't my sister answering? I saw something inside that thing's chest. It was moving like a worm, and I felt like it was trying to break free. And just before it fell on my nephew, I realized why my sister wasn't answering her phone. She must have put it on silent so she wouldn't be disturbed in her sleep. The worm-like thing broke free from the creature and fell onto my nephew's chest. He woke up and started crying, but it was too late. The terrifying larva was looking for an opening to crawl into, and it found one. My nephew screamed as the worm moved into his mouth and went down his esophagus. The other creature looked toward the webcam for a moment, as if it knew I was watching it. It was the first time I had ever felt so useless. There was nothing I could do except watch as the abomination walked away. Leaving my nephew to struggle against the worm, the thing disappeared from the screen. Just as the bedroom door opened, my sister appeared in the room. She had heard crying and came to check if her baby was okay. I watched her pick up my nephew to hold him in her arms. I couldn't hear her, but I was sure she was singing. All I could do was watch her try to calm him down. I had let my nephew down. I couldn't save him from that thing. It had implanted something in him. I didn't know what that kind of worm was, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know. In the panic, I hadn't even thought to take screenshots, and by forgetting that, it was like I had also let my sister down. I couldn't protect anyone. After losing my job, I had no choice but to move back near my family. My father pulled some strings and found me a job. I stayed with friends for a short while before finding my own apartment. Several months went by, and I started lying to myself. It was so much easier for me to deny everything that had happened. And quickly, I managed to put that horrible night in a corner. I convinced myself my burnout and hallucinations caused me to lose my job, shutting these thoughts away in my mind. The more time passed, the more I convinced myself that this new version of events was real. My nephew kept growing. He's 2 years old now, and he looks perfectly healthy. He's adorable. During the times when I couldn't convince myself that I had imagined it all, I comforted myself by telling myself that this larva hadn't had any negative effect on him. If I use past tense, it's because that's not true anymore. All these products. When my sister left my nephew with me for a few hours, while she went to the spa, I let him bounce on my knees and made funny faces to make him laugh. And as we were face to face, I saw something horrible. He blinked, and a kind of membrane appeared vertically. At the same moment, I could have sworn I saw something move on his chest, just under his bodysuit. It looked like he had a snake moving under his skin, hiding in his flesh. I've been telling you all this for several minutes now, and all this time, the only thing I could think about was that bird, the gray cuckoo. You see, the gray cuckoo is a bird that rarely raises its own young. Instead, usually it sneaks into another bird's nest and lays its eggs there. Once they hatch, the baby cuckoos push their fake brothers and sisters out of the nest, and the adoptive parents are left to raise these little imposters. I think that's exactly what this thing did. And now, my sister and her husband are taking care of its offspring. Now let's move on to the question I have to ask you. I've been thinking for a while about what I should do with him. He's no longer my sister's child, not anymore. He's no longer my nephew. He's the thing that killed my nephew. He's the thing that's going to grow up, to implant itself and kill other poor children. My God, I can't believe I'm saying this. But I have to put an end to him, don't I? I can't let him grow up and spread. How many of these abominations are alive right now, mimicking the actions and gestures of those they've possessed? I feel like I'm completely losing my mind, like none of this is real. It's impossible for something like this to happen. Please, tell me I've lost my mind. Tell me that all of this is just the product of my sick mind. Please, tell me I shouldn't do what I'm thinking of doing with the pillow that's right next to me. I'm begging you, tell me I don't have to smother my nephew. If you walk alone at night, no matter where you're going, you might run into him. It's often the case when the street or path you're on is completely deserted, but always when night has fallen, he can appear at any moment from anywhere. But generally, things always happen the same way. You're walking to get home, the road is quite long, and you have to take rather dark paths or completely empty streets. As you walk, you feel the air getting colder and colder, giving you a few chills down your neck. You turn around, but there's no one there, so you keep walking without thinking much about it. The first sign of its appearance, but simply the passing of a light, cool breeze. The fog should start to appear after a few minutes. Let's add a little more to your already present anxiety. You turn around once again, but again, no one is there. The place is still just as deserted, to the point that you feel like screaming wouldn't do any good. You might also notice a strange smell, a burning smell, but not just any kind. You know, it's that smell you get when flesh is burning. A lot of people mistake that smell for dampness, but as you might guess, that's not the case. When you start walking again, all these signs will intensify. The smell will get stronger and the fog will get thicker. But most of all, you'll feel chills running through your whole body shortly after that. Normally, you should hear it. What you just heard is not a product of your imagination. And to confirm all that, you look to see where the sound is coming from behind you. What you see might seem trivial at first glance, and that might have reassured you because it is simply a person. On a bicycle, the person pedals slowly, very slowly, the heavy silence of the place only echoing the slight sound of their chains against the wheels. But this person is strange. Because he has this little habit, he rings his bell every 10 or 15 seconds. Even if the fog can eventually reduce visibility slightly, you know that the person on the bike saw you, so I warn you like that. But very quickly, you'll realize that something is wrong, because you'll see the features of his face become clearer as the bike moves forward. It's a man, a woman. People say that it's a man. Because he doesn't have a feminine figure, but his face doesn't look anything like that of a human being. His mouth is strangely shaped, even though he smiles, and in a rather strange way since the corners of his lips almost reach his ears. He doesn't have any teeth, so it's only natural to notice that about him first. Since this black hole is deformed, what you'll see instead of his mouth, it contrasts perfectly with the fog. But above all, with the color of his skin. It's actually harder to notice the color of his skin at first glance, since it's as white as snow. Otherwise, if you asked yourself at that moment whether it was really a human being on a bicycle, you would probably answer yes. That it is most certainly a corpse that has been placed there, on a saddle. But do you know many corpses that are able to ride a bicycle? Even worse, who would even dare to alert you to their presence by ringing the bell? Of course, the rest of his face isn't very bright either, his eyes piercing through the fog. They will become clearer as he gets closer to you. He doesn't have eyelids, so you won't risk seeing him blink. Anyway, he'll be way too busy staring at you, because yes, he'll be looking at you. Even when he walks right past you, continuing on his way, his eyes will stay locked on yours, without his head moving at all. At the same time, you'll notice that he doesn't have a single hair on his head. The man on the bicycle tends to cause people he passes to freeze up in fear. Sometimes, even if he passes just centimeters from you, you don't move at all. Afterwards, he will just keep pedaling straight ahead, putting more and more distance between you and him. You might then think that you're in the clear. But as you might suspect, there is no story in this world so macabre that could end on such a happy note. You will then hear something strange, something peculiar, and for the older among you, it might awaken a certain nostalgia. The metallic sound that scrapes with each push the man makes on the pedals quickly gives you a clue. His bike has derailed. He will then gradually slow down until he finally comes to a complete stop. The man will then stand up, right next to his bike, and then he will stay there for a little while without saying anything, staring straight ahead. A little strange anecdote. Even if you see him from behind at that precise moment, you can feel it. You can sense that he's still smiling. And the next moment, he will come to confirm your feeling. He will then drop his bike on the ground and gradually turn around. Maybe it's your paralysis that keeps you from running far behind. Or maybe it's because you feel that it wouldn't do any good. Because when you look around, you'll realize how thick the fog has become and that it's acting like a kind of impenetrable wall. Even worse, it's as if you've been thrown into another dimension, in which this man and you are the only and happy owners of this gloomy place. The man will gradually end up facing you, and once that's done, several possibilities will be available to you. The first is to ignore him, but doing that gives him the chance to show you just how extremely fast he is. Even better, he'll take the opportunity to show you that his mouth can open even wider. And the icing on the cake is that he'll even go so far as to show you that a human head can be swallowed like an egg. And almost as quickly. You obviously have another option, which is to run away. But you know, what you felt earlier wasn't just a simple assumption. The endless fog will first surround you as you run. Then, you'll quickly notice some disturbing little details. Like that fire hydrant that appeared 3 times during your run. Or that little soda can that was left on the road, that you'll see once, then again, over and over, and then you'll understand. No matter where you go running, you'll never be far from man. Even worse, man will only have to simply walk to catch up with you. So there's only the third solution left, which your heart would normally have dictated to you in a more conventional situation, but which your fears had completely pushed aside. And this solution is the best of them all. Even if, in the end, crossing paths with the man on the bicycle somehow doomed you to something else, you will then have to ask him a simple question, and that question is, do you need help? The eyes of the man on the bicycle will not change and will always be fixed on yours. On the other hand, and this, even at a rather reasonable distance, you won't be able to help but notice his smile, which is starting to widen. And against all odds, he will gently nod his head up and down. Offering him your help is your one and only way out. And of course, you'll have to keep your commitment. So you'll have to walk slowly toward the man. And whatever you do, don't look him in the eyes. You'll quickly notice that the smell of burning is coming directly from him. And the little blocks you might hear are nothing more than the small drops of drool coming from the man's mouth. To come and hit the floor, avoid trembling or showing your fear, and ignore the horrible sound of his ragged breathing. And above all, don't forget that at the slightest mistake, your head could suddenly disappear. To end its journey in the stomach of this strange creature, putting a derailed bicycle back in place. And normally, it's child's play. But believe me, it's much harder with trembling hands. You'll then have to double your efforts and do it quickly, because I'm not quite sure he's very patient. If you finally manage to get the bike back up, slowly move away from it while continuing to avoid the man's gaze. He should then sit back on it and start pedaling to continue on his way without even looking back. The fog all around you will then gradually begin to fade and the horrible smell will eventually disappear completely. You'll be back on your street, free from any strange time loop and able to continue on your way. As if nothing ever happened. Lucky for you, you survived the encounter with the man on the bike. But unfortunately for you, as I told you earlier, the Crusader condemns you to something else. Luckily for you, if you ignore all the signs that will follow in the days to come. And throughout your life, everything should go well. Yes, the man on the bicycle will return sometimes, from time to time, to pay you a little visit. There is no more talk of fog or smell, but you will see him again. You might even run into him in broad daylight, driving along as if nothing happened, his horrible eyes always fixed on you. No one except you will see him, even if he is surrounded by a crowd of other people, for example. Others as well. It is reported that sometimes they hear his bell before falling asleep, right next to their ear. But don't worry, because as I told you earlier, as long as you ignore these signs, nothing will happen. Nothing. On the other hand, if you happen to hear his bell at night, and unfortunately you get the urge to open your eyes, I can't even imagine the look on your wife's face, your husband's or your parents', when they find your body without a head, lying in bed,